Assalamu alaikum everyone, and welcome again to the Virtual Open Iftar 2021. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Adnan, and I'll be hosting for the first half of the session. We'll then be joined by Farah in the second half. So today we have an event around the mosque designs in Britain, and we're joined by Shahid. I'll have a bit more of introduction to him a little bit later on before explaining a bit more about the agenda and the program of activities today. So first and foremost, I want to be able to thank our media partners for this year. We have the Islam Channel, so a special welcome to all the guests joining us from the Islam Channel's Facebook and YouTube. It's a pleasure to have you here joining us today. Also want to give a shout out to Arts Council UK, who without their help we wouldn't be doing what we are right now. So all the support is definitely helping us to be able to put this program together and offer the interactions that we do. That being said, RTP is definitely, we value everyone's inputs, and you can check out more of our work online as well. And we really want to be able to encourage everyone to get involved with the Ramadan Open Iftar packs that we have online. A lot of the work behind that helps to be able to not only feed people around the world in terms of charity, but also there's lots of cool different gift bags inside it as well that you can find. So our work this Ramadan is supported by Islamic Relief, and they are charity partners. And you can check out their incredible work online at Islamic Relief as well at iruk.co/RTP. Right, okay, so since we're on Zoom, this is recorded today. However, we do encourage everyone to put the cameras on. We like to make this interactive. We want to be able to see who's around, where you're joining from, how your iftar is going. And I think we're nearly 19 days in now, so it's more of an interaction. But some more of the rules around Zoom really is, if you're on the desktop version, you can see at the bottom there's an option that says reactions. The reactions button is really cool to be able to interact with not only us but also the speaker, be able to ask questions by raising your hand, and then we can come on to you straight away, or you can also just have any of the other emojis on there as well. So I think you've got a clap, a thumbs up, you're feeling really, there's a joy button there as well. Cool. So I think on the mobile phone, if you're joining us from mobile phone, I think there is a more section, and from the more section you can then use the reaction button in the same fashion as well. So that should be available. Right, so that's all the house rules. Right, the plan and agenda for today, let's run through that quickly. So we started a couple of minutes late, but never mind, because we have a lot of time ahead. And we do apologize for the rate runnings as well. However, we're going to have an introduction to the speaker around about half past 7, and it will be about 20 minutes long presentation, I believe, followed by a question and answer section at 7:50. The question and answer section will run for about 25 minutes or so before the azan at 8:25 today. So we'll look to conclude at 8:25, maybe a few minutes just before that as well for a reflection period. And then normally after the azan, we'll come back and do the final round off as well. Okay, but before we do that, obviously we like to see who's around and what's happening. Not seeing too many people on Zoom today as well. I don't know what's going on. Maybe it's Jummah and everyone's, got their own plans today, but definitely going to try and grab Khathum here as well. If I can unmute you and have a little chat. Assalamu alaikum, Khathum. How you doing?
I'm good. Thanks. How are you?
I'm good. Where are you joining us from today?
From London.
From London, okay. North,
Yeah.
south, west, east. Which
East.
one's
East.
East London? So I'm actually looking to move to East London very soon. So I've got a few viewings near Stratford area.
Yeah.
Right. Fingers crossed I can find the right place. And how's your fast and how's generally Ramadan been so far?
It's been good. I've had, I guess the beginning's always hard. But other than that, like over the last few days, it's been pretty good. Alhamdulillah. Yeah.
Good. I actually find it after the first week for sure, it definitely becomes the same thing, right? I don't think I even eat anything in the morning now. It's officery. I think it's all just a bit of water is enough to go, and you got the whole day ahead. So you're saying no to this? I
can't. I have to at least eat, even if it's just a fruit. I can't just go without eating.
What do you go for?
Either I usually make like smoothies for like the whole family.
You make
And
jalebis, did you say?
smoothies.
Oh, smoothies. Oh, smoothies in the morning. What kind of smoothies are we talking about?
Um, Dates, because we have a lot of dates. So dates with like either like berries or bananas as well.
Good shout.
Yeah.
Good shout. Oh, okay. I need to maybe get into it one day. I was trying to explain to my workplace. So I tried making the 9 to 10 period. I just sort of like book it off to say no meetings and that, just because I want to be able to get an extra hour of sleep if I can.
Yeah.
But I was trying to explain to them there's so many benefits of fasting. It's not just about not being able to eat. And the first question is always like, you must be hungry, you must be, really like cranky, all that. It's just like, no, actually, it's actually very nice. And I read a lot about how the body actually goes into this state of not only detox but rejuvenation, and it starts to sort of heal itself. So I'm gonna have a little chat with the workplace and sort of explain the benefits. Are you working at the moment, or are you studying? What's your
I'm working at the moment. Yeah.
what do you do?
So I'm an assistant producer at like a creative charity organization.
Oh, okay, nice. And that's
Yeah.
in London as well, I suppose.
Yeah.
It sounds like you're enjoying it. You've got a big smile on your face when you're talking about work. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm enjoying it partly because I've started recently. So I guess I'm still like on a bit of like, I guess, excited about it a little bit. I don't know how I'll be in like a few months or a
Yeah.
year maybe, but for now I'm enjoying it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it gets better normally. My experiences were once you get more experience, when you know what's going on with the workplace as well, like, sort of got better, and then comes the process. But
Mm.
that's what mine is anyway. But no, that sounds really good. I'm actually gonna bring in Shahid as well, because it'd be quite good just to hear your perspective and how it's going as well. So I'm from Shahid. How you doing?
Oh, Sam, yeah, good, thanks. All good.
Good, good. Are you also joining from London?
Yeah, I'm in East London actually, so I don't know where you're thinking of moving to, but maybe nearby.
Since I mean your background is architecture as well, I suppose. So maybe you can uh, give me
Where are
some
you,
recommendations.
yeah, where are you moving from?
So I'm based west in Reading, and I was in south for a little bit, but more towards Epsom area, which doesn't I don't know if it counts as London,
Yeah.
but I don't want to be in the south, and I don't want to be in the north. There's not enough happening in that area, so I'm thinking either west or east. And at the moment, east is probably the most affordable.
Yeah. I mean, I think in places like around Stratford and those kind of areas are pretty good.
Bingo.
Olympic Park is there, and it's quite easy to get into town and things like that, and it's a bit cheaper. I'm near Victoria Park, so a bit closer in.
Yep.
So yeah, I mean, but as you can go from here, you can just go outwards, and then it's still pretty good all the way out, really.
That's exactly. So you hit the nail on the head. East Village is exactly where I'm looking. Only
Yeah,
because you have the park next to you, everything is convenient,
yeah,
and you can go outside further, but you can also get inside as well, which is exceptional. And before we get into the topic of mosque designs, um, talk to me a bit about sort of designs of buildings in London as well, and more specifically the one in Stratford, the ArcelorMittal, I think it is, the controversially the ugly slide, as they
yeah,
call it.
yeah.
What's your opinions on that one?
Um, yeah, it's not particularly attractive, and there's a lot of steel, isn't it? When you look at it, there's a huge amount of kind of stuff there. It seems like there's a lot more material than you need to build a tower that size. But it's quite interesting, I think, to look at. It's quite a sort of unusual structure, and I've never been up it actually. And there was that time where I don't know whether it's still there. There was a slide that you go up to the top and come down on the slide.
Yeah, I think it might still be there. I'm not sure if COVID restrictions have stopped it.
Yeah,
But that's exactly what it is, isn't it? It's unusual, which is what makes it so, I guess, appealing or attractive or
yeah,
curious.
yeah,
And maybe that's what gets the attention, because I think ArcelorMittal are probably a construction company of that sort.
yeah.
So
And I think they're
still,
steel fabricators. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so steel providers. So I think a big steel company. So I guess that's why there's so much steel in it.
it makes sense. But we got some contacts. And generally as well, how's your fast been, and how have you experienced this month? And
Yeah, it's okay. I mean, there's that sort of time in the middle of the day where you sort of feel it a bit more, and then I don't know, by iftar it doesn't seem to matter after that. So
It's all,
and
it's all
feel
the
it
same.
earlier, and then after that, it's yeah.
And do you also have anything at Seri? Maybe a smoothie, maybe nothing, just water like me.
Iftar, you mean?
At Seri,
Usually
in the
kind of
morning,
cereal or something like that. Yeah, yeah, nothing too.
just cereal. Yeah,
Yeah,
okay. So I'm not the only one that
yeah,
doesn't eat nothing. A
yeah,
little bit of food is all right, but okay, good. So it is 7:30 as promised. And so we will get into the speaker. And Shahid Salim is a practicing architect and a design studio leader at the University of Westminster. He's also a senior research fellow at the Bartlett School of Architecture. And I believe UCL working on a survey of London's project on the urban history of Whitechapel. I'm
yeah.
going to leave it there. I'm going to give you a full chance to give a full introduction to yourself as well. So on to you, Shahid.
Yeah, no, that Whitechapel project's actually more or less finished now. So I've pretty much finished the role at UCL on that particular project. So that's being written up and it's going to be published probably soon. So I'm teaching at the University of Westminster, and I teach architecture. I teach at this undergrad design studio, and I teach history and theory there. And I have an architectural practice as well, and I do sort of smallish projects. And I'm working at the moment with some of my former students, which is very nice, and a couple of them are here. So I'm hoping that they
Okay.
might be able to contribute a little bit, because we have worked on some mosque projects together as well.
That's good to hear. If you do see the names, either just ping me a message and I'll
Yeah,
put them
yeah.
up. I think some of them
These two is
have
Hannah
messaged.
and Nabiha, so that you can see them in the thing.
Hannah and Nabia, if you want to come on the video, more than welcome to as well,
Mhm.
or even interact. It'd be great to see,
Yeah,
and hear their perspective as well.
yeah. We can get them. They'll interact once I've as we have our conversation, because because what I want to talk about is the kind of predicament, or the kind of story of mosque architecture in Britain and in Europe and in the West.
Hmm.
And I think they might have some interesting ideas, because they've been thinking about that as well quite a lot, and actively designing as well. So it'll be a
That
nice
sounds good.
chance to have a conversation about it as well.
Excellent. Well, I believe you've got a presentation for us, and the topic is mosque designs in Britain. So I'll pass it on to you for for the presentation. I'm looking forward to this one.
Yeah, okay, let's see, where was my right. So what I'm going to do, I'll try and keep it pretty short. There you are. Yeah, I want to just talk about a very quick overview, not so much on the history of the mosque in Britain, because that's a sort of slightly separate topic, but I'm just going to kind of go through the story of the mosque in Britain, looking at a few examples. And I'm going to look at these examples and talk about them in relation to how the approach to the mosque has changed through the 20th century, really, and what each one, what each design suggests, and what its character is. And then I want to sort of end up with a series of questions, really. So what I'm hoping to is have like a quite nice conversation and questions for the participants who are here. And the questions are around, what's the direction that mosque architecture should take, or where should mosque architecture in Britain go from here? So let's work towards that. So the first built mosque in Britain was in 1889, and it was built in Woking. And this is an image of it, and you probably have seen it. It's quite famous now. And it was built by a Hungarian Jewish linguist. Actually, it was commissioned by a Hungarian Jewish linguist who was settling in London after having spent his life working in India. And he was very interested in the languages of India. He wanted to set up an establishment to teach the languages, and in the grounds of that organization, he wanted to build a number of pavilions. And the mosque was one of the buildings that he wanted to build, and it was intended as a kind of representation of the Muslim world as he'd experienced it. So this mosque very much falls within that period of Victorian Orientalism, and kind of the fascination with the East and the fascination with these exotic cultures, if you like. So it's a kind of exoticization of the Muslim world. and of the vision of the Muslim and, you know, the Indian world and the subcontinent and so on. So it's very much a kind of quite a flamboyant and quite expressive building, built by Europeans, largely, I suppose, for a kind of European audience. And that was the end of the 19th century. Then I'm gonna kind of jump a little bit. So I'm going to 1940s to Cardiff in South Wales, and Cardiff was quite a key location for Muslim settlement in Britain because it was a port town, and the ports were the places where Muslims first came to and settled in terms of form settled communities, because it was largely the early settlers were formed by communities from the sailors. So there were sailors working on ships, and the sailors were from Yemen and Somalia and Bangladesh, but particularly in Cardiff, it was Somali and Yemeni sailors who would be working on the ships that were going between, you know, Britain and Empire, as it were. And they would then sort of, you know, get off the ship, settle in Cardiff, get married, start a family, so on and so on. So you started to get these settled communities around the docks, and you started to get the earliest mosques in these areas. Earliest mosques mean pre World War II, and there weren't many between Woking and Cardiff. There weren't really many, if any, sort of established mosques at that time. So Peel Street was one of the streets in the docks area of Cardiff, and it was one of the earliest mosques that was built there, or established there. And what you can see from this slide is that you've got this terrace of workers' housing, sort of terrace, you know, two-story housing, pretty straightforward streets of Victorian housing. And the community had bought 3 of the houses in the middle of the street, and they had knocked the houses down but left the front facade. And in that front facade, they placed these lattice windows, you kind of mashrabiyah type windows. And then behind that, they were, and as you can see in the plan, the aim was that behind that they would build the mosque building. And I found this really interesting because this is where you start to see this fusion of the existing architecture, the existing kind of local architecture of the city, in this case Cardiff, and the introduction of an Islamic, you know, new idioms of Islamic architecture, and you get that, you start to get that combination of architectural and styles and therefore of cultural histories coming together in these buildings. So this building in Peel Street is in a way that one of the first places where you start to see that combination happening. And I find it really quite an evocative, interesting relationship. By the time, oopsie daisy, let me try and move to the next slide. Eventually the mosque looked like this. You can see it's a very you know, distinct element sitting within this very standardized Victorian urban landscape. So you get this introduction of this completely new language, which again is a really compelling image, and it's one of the earliest images that I found, and certainly the earliest mosque that I found, which is a completely new architectural language placed within the existing urban landscape. And that mosque it existed till 1988, and this is a photograph of it in 1988, just before it was actually demolished. So you can see what's happened is all the area around has been knocked down by now, and just the mosque remained, and then the mosque was not there. So it's all sort of redeveloped and so on. But really quite an interesting, distinct vocabulary in architecture. There's another mosque in Cardiff as well. It was the South Wales Islamic Centre, which you see here. This is a reconstruction of it because it was around the corner from Peel Street, and it was built between 1969 and 1979. So it existed between 69 and 79, and then it was demolished. So we did a reconstruction of it from drawings that we found in the archives. And again, it's very interesting because what you start to see in this building is the fusion of a post-war modernist architecture with an Islamic. So this circular prayer hall with this concrete shell roof was very characteristic of post-war modernism at the time. So, you know, English post-war modernism, and it's being utilized for a completely new type of cultural practice. So what you start to see in this building is the combination of architectural styles. So it's not like Peel Street, you had the house and then the mosque, and the two things gradually kind of merged. But here you start to get a new language emerging from the combination of different cultural, traditions, different architectural traditions. So again, it's the sort of attempt to create an architectural language which is distinctly, if you like, British, I think. And this is sort of moving. This is again just seven or 8 years after the South Wales Islamic Centre is the Regent's Park Mosque. It was built in 1977. It's one that you probably know. It's obviously quite a famous landmark building. It was designed by a very eminent English architect called Frederick Gibbard, who was quite a renowned modernist architect of the 20th century. And he won the competition for the mosque in 1969. And what he did is he combined, again, similarly to South Wales, he combined a series of architectural languages, quite a distinctly modernist language. So modernism would mean, for example, using the use of concrete, which was a very particular material in the modernist aesthetic, and having open walls. So you can see with this building, the walls are not load bearing, but they're curtain walls, so they're fully glazed. And that again was a characteristic of modernist architecture. So it's a very kind of modernist building in its construction methodology and its materiality, but he combined it with quite traditional Islamic elements like the dome and the minaret. And he was quite consciously doing this because he wanted to have a mosque. This was being designed as the main mosque for Muslims in Britain. It was kind of the national mosque. And he did it quite consciously because he knew that he wanted to have a building that Muslims could relate to and understand. So he quite consciously utilized recognizable Islamic symbols as such as the dome and minaret, but he tried to do it, he tried to sort of render them in this modernist language. So again, like with South Wales, it's this kind of fusion of architectural languages and an attempt to create an architecture which is particular to the place that it's in, like this place that it's in terms of the European or the UK context. So just to think a little bit about a kind of social history, there was, 1947, the partition of India, and the gradual and the start of the period of decolonization. So Britain retreating from its kind of imperial role, and colonies, former colonies becoming independent, and then various kind of acts. I mean, this kind of just lists a series of kind of immigration acts through the decades after the partition of India, which were being formulated in response to migration into Britain from the former colonies, so from the West Indies, from South Asia, later on from East Africa and so on. So large-scale migration coming into this country, Muslim migration, and the kind of new multicultural society emerging. So that was a kind of climate post-war that you started to get a more multicultural character to the nation. And the other thing that I'm interested in is I think quite a lot about is the process of colonization, and then the moment, if you like, of decolonization, and what happens to histories, to culture, to traditions through that process of colonization. And it's often called a rupture, a kind of colonial rupture. And this quote from historian is quite interesting. So he says that colonialism breaks things, it shatters an imagined wholeness. The colonizer explodes native and cultural solidarity, producing the spiritual confusion, psychic wounding, and economic exploitation of a new and dominated other. Colonial rupture is the social, psychological, cultural, and economic equivalent of a paradigm shift. Words and relations on either side of the colonial rupture are incommensurate. So he's saying that there's this quite massive, break that colonization forces on people. And on the two sides of that rupture, you end up with two quite distinct, the way I understand it is you end up with these two quite distinct and different trajectories. So in a way, for example, there's a certain continuity, let's say, in Muslim history and in Muslim, thinking and culture and philosophy and so on, that you could argue stretches from the time of the Prophet up till the period of colonization, which would be, let's say, 18th century onward, 18th century through to the early or mid 20th century. And that period of colonization breaks that tradition. And it's not, I'm not saying that there was a tradition which was, one tradition. There were many traditions, many Islamic traditions. There was, of course, conflict within those different, dynasties and peoples and nations and so on. I'm sure all of that happened, but nevertheless, I think there was still a certain type of continuity, certainly in terms of artistic and cultural production. So our architecture, culture traveled across and circulated through the Muslim world from that time of the Prophet through to the point of colonization. And then there was this break. And then on the other side of the break is this period post independence. And it's the other side of the break that I'm interested in, which is that kind of diaspora, because I think that's what we're in now. And where we are and what we represent is the other side of that process of colonization. It's the kind of remaking now, the reconstitution of these cultural trajectories. So I feel really that what the kind of what diasporas are involved in is a process of reconstruction of cultural, historic, religious, and architectural and artistic reconstruction. There are attempts to reconnect with that tradition that has been kind of broken or ruptured, if you like. So it's interesting to think about the mosque in Britain or in the diaspora as one part of that process of attempts to reconstruct. And I think the question then comes up is, in what way does that reconstruction happen? Is it an attempt to simply replicate history, or is there an attempt to sort of create a new language, which is part historical and part based on the contemporary? And I think that's where the kind of idea of that I think that's the kind of dialogue that the mosque is involved in at the moment. So in the early period of post-war migration, so from the sort of 1960s, 1990s, if you like, the mosques that were being built by first generation migrants. They were often built in this quite an ad hoc style where different architectural languages were brought together. So lots of kind of Islamic references, and they were combined with the local architecture of a particular place. So in these examples, you see local brickwork is used, there's pitched roofs, there's windows that you might find on houses. So there's kind of there's a combination of the local vernacular architecture of the particular place that they're in, being combined with replicated Islamic elements through that period. And so you end up with this kind of amalgamated or ad hoc architecture. It's less deliberate than Regent's Park Mosque or South Wales Islamic Centre, which were kind of designed, as it were. This is more, it kind of happens as people design it themselves in very many cases. What happened after that was, so this is just talking about, again, kind of social history from 1989 onwards, or from 1979, 1989 onwards, a kind of global emergence of the idea of the kind of a kind of Muslim category. And that happened in this country, I think really from 1989 onwards, where the Rushdie protest was seen as the first point at which a distinctly Muslim political and cultural identity emerged in Britain. Before that, migrants from South Asia and so on were considered more racially than they were religiously. So they were Asian or black and so on. But it's really from 89 onwards that the category of Muslim emerged as the primary identifier. And it was I think it was the 2001 census, which was the first one to include religion as a category. So you see this kind of process of the construction of the category of Muslim as a primary identifier happening over a period of time. So before that, there was no religious identification on the census, for example. So I think along with that, I think what I've observed is the re-emergence of a particular kind of historicism in the architecture of the mosque. So this is in my research, I sort of like pinpoint that down to this particular building in Leeds, which was in 1996, designed by an Iraqi-born architect, engineer based in UK, called Atba al-Samurai. He's a very prolific mosque designer. And he designed this mosque in Leeds. And it was the first one really, I think, where idea of the mosque as an amalgam of different styles is replaced with the idea of a mosque as a kind of fully Islamic historicist representation. So as you can see in this drawing, and these are the photographs of it, compared to the previous photographs, there isn't that combination of architectural styles. There isn't the pitched roof, there isn't the kind of gables, there isn't any kind of referencing to the local architecture. It's a distinctly sort of, historicist, other objects. It's talking about being of a different cultural trajectory. And I sort of wonder whether this went along with the reemergence of the kind of category of Muslim as a distinct social and political category, which was, UK based, but also a global trend, I think, as well. And another other example. So the Leeds Mosque was the first one, I think, but there were other examples that followed. So this one in Leicester, which is a kind of a replica of a Fatimid Egyptian mosque, although the community was a Indian Gujarati community. This one in Bradford, which again was designed by Al Samurai, which is really kind of like a celebratory Islamic building. The sandstone here was from Agra, lots of minarets, lots of domes, and this is a very distinct building in the landscape in Bradford, and a number of mosques in this vein, early 20th century, so the 2000s, 2010s, this kind of period. So alongside this, there's also the idea of the kind of modern mosque, if you like, the kind of avant-garde, modernist design. And these are a couple of examples by Mangueiras architects. And here you can see that the visual language and the aesthetics are very different now. They're very much in a kind of more sort of architecturally, I suppose avant-garde, modernist contemporary language. So their references are very different. The root sources that they're looking at for their language, for their architectural language, is really very different from these buildings that are looking to Islamic history. And these buildings might combine sort of Islamic references in different ways. This is a proposal for a mosque in Copenhagen, which again, similarly, is quite a modern, contemporary version or interpretation. And the architect saying here that it's a Nordic interpretation of Islamic architecture and brings the meeting of Nordic and Islamic building traditions to Denmark for the first time. So the idea of the mosque, the architecture being this kind of cultural meeting point and cultural fusion is another line. And I'll just show a few examples of buildings in that vein. This was a proposal for a mosque in Copenhagen, and this was by quite very prominent architects called BIG. So these are, I suppose, you could say sort of Western architects, like non-Muslim architects, designing mosques, and they're looking at them as a way of them combining different languages. But again, they're not necessarily going they're not necessarily drawing deliberately from traditional sources, but it's very much a reinterpretation of traditional sources in certain ways. I mean, abstraction, reinterpretation to various degrees. And then this one is one built in Sydney, which is a very interesting one, because again, it's a very distinctly contemporary language with certain inflections of Islamic architecture, interpretations of traditional Islamic motifs. And this one in Turkey by Emre Aralat Architects, which is built partly into the landscape, again quite abstracted, quite modernist in its materials and also in its treatment, the kind of spaces that it's creating, the concrete, the concrete materiality of it as well, and the light that sort of comes down. So it's a very sort of distinctly and not a traditionally Islamic space. And then also, so alongside those examples where the buildings are quite modern, contemporary, also contemporary examples of the mosque, which is again reflecting or referencing traditional typologies, but interpreting them in a different, innovative way, if you like. So this one is in Cologne, And you can see it's a Turkish community, and it's commissioned by the Turkish government, actually, in fact, and or the kind of religious authority of the Turkish government. And you can see that it's kind of based on the idiom of a Ottoman mosque, but it's treating that whole language in quite a distinct and different way. And then just to look at a couple of my own proposals, just to give an idea of where I've tried to sort of negotiate this architecture as well. This is tiles that I was looking at they're in the V&A Museum, and I was looking at this kind of tile pattern, which is quite a common pattern across kind of Central Asia around the sort of 13th century. And I was using that as the basis to create this facade for the mosque that I designed just on Hackney Road. And I was interested in using that tile pattern, but abstracting it. So it's kind of a direct reference to a point of Islamic history, but it's also quite an abstracted way of treating it. And I wanted to sort of try and create, and what I tried to do is create that balance between something which is in a way quite rooted in sort of traditional sources, which are quite literal and quite readable, but sort of combines it with other approaches, other kind of architectural approaches and materials and designs and so on. This one is in Aberdeen, which I designed a couple of years ago, or was built a couple of years ago. And this one is in Perth in Scotland, which is just getting planning permission at the moment. So the idea is that they would be buildings which kind of fit in their landscape, but they're also sit slightly differently to their landscape as well. So they are representing quite a different culture and a new way of doing things, if you like, but they are also connected. And that's the kind of way that I try to approach these buildings. And just last example is Cambridge Mosque, which is an interesting one again, because it sits, the ambition of the Cambridge Mosque was that it should be an English mosque, so that when the client set out to design it, that he said, and the architect said, that this should be a building which is particularly, rooted in its place, but connected to Islamic history. And the idea was that it was based on the garden, the kind of idea of the Islamic garden, which you can see in the bottom right-hand corner. And the plan is based on that. It's quite a traditional movement that you have through the plan, from the garden at the front to the portico to the kind of foyer, and then into the prayer hall, which is tilted towards Mecca. But that procession is quite a traditional procession through Islamic architecture in many examples. So there's a very sort of traditional root to the building, I think, a kind of basis to it. Sorry, this is the front elevation of it. So as you kind of walk in through the garden into the main portico here, and the kind of distinct feature of it is these other geometric columns that you get. They become these kind of timber trees, and they're all based on quite distinct Islamic pattern work. It's called the Breath of the Compassionate. It's quite a sort of established Islamic geometry, and that geometry kind of runs through the building in different places. It's in the sort of door designs and so on, but it sort of characterizes creates the vaults of the mosque building itself. So again, it's very much attempting to be a reinterpretation or a new treatment of quite traditional and historic Islamic lineage. So again, it's that idea of trying to connect with an Islamic history. So the idea of the diaspora trying to reconnect or reconstruct a particular type of trajectory, a particular connection with Islamic history, culture, arts, and so on, through the buildings that they build here. And that just takes me to the last slide, where it's a kind of summary of the things that we've looked at, or suggesting a summary, which is, and this is really a question, which is, are we looking at these typologies, if you like? So there's kind of the Victorian exoticism. There's the fusion of styles as represented by Regent's Park, the historicism of the Bradford Mosque and other sort of ones, which are these kind of very much replicas of Islamic buildings. And I think what they're saying is that this is what a correct or authentic Islamic building should be. And then there's these, much more avant-garde approach, where the architectural language is drawing from a whole series of other references, a whole series of, in a way, you could argue, a kind of European trajectory of architecture. and that forms the basis for the mosque. But it becomes, you know, inflected with bits of Islamic tradition. But the kind of core of it is coming from if you like, I suppose, a kind of European architectural tradition. So for the sake of the conversation, really, it's a question is, which direction, you know, where does the mosque sit, or where do you think it should sit in terms of the future direction that it goes in from here, within this kind of landscape of approaches that we see over the last, you know, 100 years of mosque architecture in this country? Where's the mosque to go now in terms of its architectural style? So I think that will, yeah, let's try and open that up, really. I think that would be a good place to start. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Shahid. I think you can share some of the screens. The pictures are really good. I actually quite like. So, I mean, first and foremost, thank you for that informative talk. There's actually quite a lot in there that I have a lot of questions on. But before I get into it as well, just want to say thank you. Welcome to Farah, who has just joined us now.
Hi, everyone.
Welcome, salam, Farah. I do have to unfortunately go at some point, so Farah will take over. But before I go, I do want to also say as well, I believe, Shahid, your students are here as well, so I encourage them to ask questions and engage as well, just for Farah's knowledge as well, that the students are here as well. I believe Nabi has just put the camera on now. So before I go though, I do want to say, the designs that you had for the Hackney Road one, I believe, I'll tell you why I like that. And I'll tell you why it's important to me. So I grew up in Pakistan when I was younger, and I remember seeing that around. I remember seeing those specific patterns around. So for me, it's almost like a journey back to my past, but also my childhood. You come to the UK and you don't necessarily find a mosque that looks like that. You just find normal house, really. So when you see that, you see that in England, and you walk around, you instantly hits you, reminds you of home. That for me is why I thought I really like that pattern. And so then the question, there's loads of different questions, but you know, like, people have come from all walks of life, from different areas and different places, different cultures, and all that sort of stuff. Shouldn't they also want to see that familiarity in the new home as well? Shouldn't the new modern mosque look like that? So I don't know if this is a question there, but I just want to know more about, you know, it'd be, for me, I'd love to be able to go see that pattern and stuff, but not only for my sake, but also, you know, taking that lineage of our culture with us and understanding, actually, look, we have come to a new place. I want to be able to see this going forward. I want to be able to be a part of this and stuff as well. I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that you have that response to the building, because that's one of the things that I'm quite aware of, or quite conscious of, is that you know, the people who are using these buildings, people who are using mosques, are coming. Many of them are migrants, you know, first generation. So they have experiences and memories and, you know, thoughts about buildings that they will have experienced and used back home, as it were. And even if they're second or third generation, you know, there's still the kind of visual language of somebody who's kind of second generation or third generation in this country. They will have got a lot of kind of their aesthetic experience from their parents, of culture, and so on and so on. So I think, you know, a lot, you know, most the people who are largely using mosques do have this kind of alternative visual and aesthetic register in their minds and in their experience. And to me, it's quite important to respond to that rather than to leave it behind completely. And that's why I do try to sort of keep that connection in the buildings that I design. But then also, you know, from the point of view of architecture, or kind of architectural history, you know, and the idea of modernism and modernity, we have a kind of culture which is not necessarily, it's not problematic, but the characteristic of our culture is we need to always progress. Ideas always need to change, and we shouldn't be looking back to kind of revive things that have happened before. We should be designing new things, and that's again an interesting tension within architectural culture, which is, you know, you look forwards, you bring things back from the past. So I think, you know, as architects, we're caught between this, in a way, dilemma, and I think it's about trying to bridge that so that the work that we do is, on the one hand, progressive still, but so it kind of reinterprets things in new ways, but it doesn't leave it completely. I feel like it's kind of a tightrope that we try to walk, or that I'd like to try to walk, because I think it's important to retain that connection, but not to simply replicate.
Yeah, because I mean, when you say a mosque, to most people, they'll think of a dome. That's the first thing that comes to your mind, or even the minarets that come up. And when I saw some of the other pictures, I can't remember which one it was. Maybe it was the one in Denmark. Oh no, sorry, the Harrow. Yeah, the one in Harrow. I would have never thought that was a mosque. You know, that looks like a very modern library. That's what came to my mind. So then that poses the question of, well, what is a mosque at the end of the day? It's just an area to pray, but also we're sort of, you know, from our history books and also our knowledge and traditions as well. Traditionally, it's lots of colors and domes and that sort of stuff. I don't want to take up too much time. I do have to go, but I'm going to pass. And we have a question from Nabia as well. But I'm going to pass on to Farah to introduce and lead. Thank you, Shahid, from my side anyway, if I don't see you again, but I'll definitely be in touch. Farah, on to you. I think we've lost Farah. I think I'm staying. I'm going to unmute Nabia.
Yeah, and Nabiha, remember, we can't talk about what we've just done.
Yeah, no, I wasn't going to.
We just done.
Yeah, just to add on to what Adnan was saying about the identity of a mosque and having a dome and having certain features. I think what's really interesting from I'm not an architect yet, but from an architect's point of view, is to remember that mosques or places of prayer, especially for Muslims, don't really have to have a certain identity. It doesn't have to have a mosque. We can pray anywhere we want. And I think that's quite interesting as well, especially when you look at a place like London, where like the religious landscape is so broad. Like you have mosques that are in converted grocery shops, but you also have beautiful mosques like Regent's Park Mosque, which have been purpose built. And I think that's quite important to see how different communities express their faith spaces and how they sort of sometimes passively appear in terms of conversions of old buildings, even old churches. I think Shah has researched Brick Lane Mosque as well, which used to be a church and a synagogue, which is really important as well. Really interesting. So yeah, when you look at a place like London, it really can sort of exist as a huge, quite a broad number of things. But when you sort of consider different contexts, maybe it is important to take into account the cultural and heritage connotations that a mosque might have in those specific areas. So I think that's quite an important way to think about it.
I think that's a good point. It's a conversation I don't think many people have or even think about, and I think that's why it's so interesting. I learned a lot just by looking at the journey of mosques in one way. And what came to my mind as well, so we talked about immigration and new immigrants coming in and having to sort of have that influence. What about from the other side? What about the English locals? What was their notion? For example, in Wales, in the ports, or even in London, seeing a new mosque come up, they've never seen it before. What does that mean for them?
I mean, there's always throughout stuff that I've looked at, historically looking at kind of mosques that are being built in the earlier periods, 70s, 80s, that kind of stuff. There was always, some opposition and disconcerted responses and so on, and responses about the kind of alien character of the buildings and things like that. But I think they're sort of single, handful, if you like. I mean, a lot of mosques generate a lot of opposition in some locations, in some places, and they face quite a lot of difficulty, and it's a long process to be able to get them built and so on. But I don't think it's there hasn't necessarily been a lot. You would get comments about the design or about it being an alien type of building and so on and so on, but I think it's more more of the focus is on the number of people that are going to come or the nuisance that it's going to cause and things like that. So more kind of practical sort of functional things rather than the kind of architecture of it in itself, I think.
Okay, that's interesting. I haven't myself heard of any sort of downfalls or issues with mosques, not necessarily. It's been more about, for example, in Reading, we used to basically go to this mosque that was a converted house. And I can't tell you for how many years basically the whole community outgrew the whole place, but still no one had enough money to be able to grow it. And it wasn't until I think I guess the younger generation, when they started connecting with the mosque more, then they could pour money in to buy a new place. So what they did in Reading was they actually converted one of those. It was a large office. It used to be an office before. They basically broke it down and made a bespoke mosque out of it. There isn't a dome or anything around it, but when you go inside, again, the architecture inside is incredible. Everything is not only modern, but it also reflects back to the emeralds and the colors, the gold, that sort of stuff that you'd see. And I think it works. It does work, and I say it works because the community, the mosque, the management team, they've seen an uptake of people coming to the mosque now of all ages. So I think it makes a big difference, for everyone that goes past as well. And from the perspective of the locals, the issues are more around parking and people sort of, abusing that power. However, I think more and more people do definitely look at it and say, actually, we want to know more about it as well, which is definitely interesting. I want to know a bit more lighthearted as well. Your favorite mosques, maybe in the UK or around as well, and why. We talked about Cambridge, and I think we had someone from Cambridge come down before and talk about Cambridge Mosque specifically. But just to get a sort of a glimpse of what your preferences are on mosques and why, or what does it mean for you?
Yeah, I should have thought I should have an answer to that question. I suppose, yeah. Well, I think one of the mosques that I like in terms of the way it works as a community building is the Muslim Cultural Heritage Centre in Ladbroke Grove. I don't know if you know that, or if people know that, but it's actually designed by the same architects who designed Regent's Park Mosque. Frederick Gibbard had passed away by then, but his office carried on and designed that building. And it's a very sort of like compact and well organized series of spaces. So there's a prayer hall, and then behind the prayer hall there's a more open glazed courtyard area, and then behind that or alongside that there are the more sort of offices and community facilities and library and so on. And then it's a very flexible building, so the courtyard area can become part of the prayer hall, and there's extra people to overspill, and it functions just very well as a kind of everyday sort of prayer space and community space, I think. So I think that one I really like because of its the way its functionality and the way it can be used and the layout. It's all very well thought through. I mean, yeah, Regent's Park Mosque I think is a sort of really I think it's a really great space, an experiential kind of building. Yeah, but also Hannah's here, who's one of my former students as well, who we've been working with. So I think she's probably got lots of ideas about.
I was just about to say, I'll unmute you, Hannah, as well.
Yeah, hi, assalamu alaikum. It's an amazing talk, and yeah, it's been an honor working with Shahid. And just like a few comments about mosque. I think because I visited Cambridge Mosque just before lockdown, like a few weeks before lockdown, and so like experiencing it firsthand. I understand why some people weren't too happy about it in terms of it becoming more of a tourist attraction than a place of worship, because architecture is beautiful. But I think the second issue was that not a lot of people were used to having women praying right behind men. So, you would see people walking in a bit like, not aimlessly, but they're a bit confused about what to do. But I think coming from like my country back home, we have that a lot, where women, there's not even a partition, just women pray behind the men, and they fill up from the back and the men fill up from the front. So I think if it was exercised more in the UK, I feel like it could also bring more women to mosques and sort of build up the like the community feeling that women experience in mosques. And just design wise, it's quite, being an eco mosque, it was something that was quite new for us as Muslims, like quite a step forward. So yeah, but to speak in terms of a favorite mosque, for me it's Regent's Park, because it's childhood. So so yeah, that's how lots of people choose their mosque, because that's the one that they grew up with.
Yeah. And just for the audience as well, sorry, Hannah, where are you from?
Oh, I'm from Syria.
From Syria. Okay, some beautiful mosques in that region as well. So that's two for Regents.
I think that's an interesting point as well that Hannah raises about the women's experience of the mosque as well, because it's obviously very different to the male experience. So I'm always quite interested in that how do women feel about many of the mosques that we're talking about, and look at when you use it quite differently, or parts of it you can use and parts of it you can't use. I mean, you two can give your thoughts on that, and I don't know, is there anyone else?
Yeah, it's open to everyone.
I think Regent's Park is a good example of having purpose-built women's space, because a lot of the time mosques don't really, or like the architect of them don't really take into account a space for women, and they mostly end up praying in like a room or like a basement that was never intended for women, but they just realize at the end, oh, like we have to have a space for women, so let's just chuck them in there. But Regent's Park does have an actual allocated women's space, so I think that's why a lot of people gravitate towards it. Obviously it's beautiful and everything, but yeah, that's a good point.
And could you, just for the viewers that might not be from London, how does it work? So is there a separate entrance for women, or how is it secluded? What are the additional benefits for this mosque?
Yeah, so Regent's Park has, so it's got a giant courtyard, and then it has a separate entrance for men, separate entrance for women's, and they just go up their stairs and they go onto a mezzanine which overlooks the men's prayer space. So they still get to be a part of the experience that men have. They still get to see the dome. They still get to hear the imam. They hear it through a speaker, but they're able to be in the same room that the imam is in, which is, I think it's a good thing, and it makes it more special for women as well. Yeah.
This is actually a topic that was raised a couple of weeks ago in a different session as well. And actually, Shahid, you've made a really good point. Actually, it'd be really good to hear from the perspective of women as well about, well, what's important for women to be able to utilize a mosque, not just for prayers, but also as a facility, because it's a community building, right? And the second part of that is, to what extent are women architects involved in designing these spaces as well, when thinking about the building and that sort of stuff as well? Does that happen? I don't know.
I mean, these guys are now, so that's one thing. I haven't come across, actually, interestingly, I haven't really come across mosques designed by women architects in this country. I mean, it does happen in other countries. Turkey, I can think of an example anyway.
Cambridge Mosque. Wasn't Cambridge Mosque designed by, like, the main person was a woman?
Yeah, she was, and her husband, her and her husband sort of designed it essentially. So her husband passed away, unfortunately. So that's why she's kind of running the practice now. So yeah, in a way that I certainly have a woman involved in that building as well.
And what kind of differences were there seen if it was designed in addition to a woman there?
Well, interestingly, so Julia Barfield, who was the architect who runs the practice, she said that she was quite, she's quite keen that the female space was very well integrated with the main space, so there wasn't like a big distinction between the spaces. I mean, I think ultimately it was a client who drove that design concept. So in Cambridge, the idea is that you have one big hall and there's a screen which separates the male and female, but the screen is higher at the sides, and at the middle it's actually right down low, isn't it? And in fact, there's one point where there's nothing in between, isn't there? I think there's like a gap between the two prayer halls. So I think the idea was that the women could choose where they wanted to be, either in a place where there's not much screening, so the screen is very low, or they could be on the parts where the screen is higher. I don't know how it actually works when you're there now. Hannah, what was it like where?
So the screens were also quite split up as well, like they were panels, and they were able to move it forward and back depending on if they had more men than women, they would move the screens back a bit. And then there was also an extra rooms behind the women's space for like kids, and so if a woman wanted to pray with their kids to like not disrupt the main hall or something. But with the time that I went, all the screens were like kind of flat and
quite low.
Like, yeah, but it was very low, like it was around waist height or
and also importantly, there's no separate entrances, is there? So you both, men and women, go in through the main.
Interesting.
That's
interesting, because I was speaking to my mum about this, and she went to the Vancouver one, and in the Vancouver one, so they had two separate areas, obviously men, women, but the kids typically, and this is a different topic as well, the kids typically are with the women, right? And there isn't any reason for why they should be. It could be with either one. But in that mosque specifically, they had a bigger space for women and a smaller space for men, because they had a dedicated area, a play area for kids to be able to interact with one another whilst the women pray, and the men pray and that sort of stuff as well. So they had all these dedicated spaces, and my mum loved it. She was like, "This is sick! Like, it's so good because you don't have to." It's probably more stressful having kids running around trying to control them whilst you're praying. So all of those things were thought about. I just wanted to raise that point. I know Farah's back as well. I know we've got about 5 minutes, so I'll pass it on to Farah for the last few minutes and stuff for any questions as well. But I just wanted to raise that point. Hi, Farah. Hopefully it doesn't freeze us.
Hi. Thank you. I'm sorry, my computer just decided to fail and do a complete restart, so I apologise.
That's all right.
First of all, really interesting talk. I've made lots of notes. I'm sorry I won't have time to ask you as many questions as I had written down. So unless this has already been addressed, how can, in design, how can we make mosques more inviting so that we encourage those from outside of the Islamic faith to understand and learn more about the Islamic faith?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably having more sort of spaces, like maybe within or outside mosques, which are dedicated public spaces. So the idea, I mean, because of the weather here, I suppose it maybe internal spaces, but they're almost like quite shared. They're open. They're sort of foyers almost, where you have different activities. You might have exhibitions or jumble sales or whatever. So different things that can actually happen, which are community events, which are shared spaces. So I think part of the problem for me is that, you get this idea of the building is completely segregated. So from the outside, you have to have a door for men and a door for women. And that is kind of problematic to me, because then families get split up. You can't spend time in the mosque together as a family. So your kids have to go one place and the mum has to go one place and so on. So, I sort of think that you should have, everything should be like as integrated as possible. And if you have to use, which more or less, is the convention, you separate the prayer halls, but that's the point at which you can say, okay, men go this way, men go that way. And then you could also have spaces where, other people can come into and cafes and exhibition spaces and, community rooms and things like that. Much more kind of outward facing. So it'd be great to be able to sort of move towards that kind of thing, I think.
And just one more question, hopefully. I know there's about 3 minutes until Adhan, so we need to thank as well. But it's really interesting what you said about immigration and colonization. I don't know if you have addressed this already, but what impact do you think decolonization and migration from former colonies has had on mosque design and accessibility as well?
Right.
So following on from that, how can we encourage more multi-cultural participation?
Yeah.
Because mosques, I find, are very cultural hubs. It's very multi-faith, it's very multicultural participation in mosques.
Yeah. That's not a sort of 90-second answer to that question, unfortunately. But so,
3 minutes. We have about 2 minutes. Yeah.
But I think, I think the thing is, it's interesting. The multi-faith thing is a kind of interesting idea, because in a way it hasn't really taken off, the idea of kind of buildings which are used by a number of different faiths. And I don't think that's a problem. I think it's quite interesting. And I think it's because communities quite like having quite distinct sort of religious spaces. And I think it's about allowing that, but then encouraging, interaction and engagement, like you're saying. So buildings can be used by different people in different ways. So I think, with some of the bigger mosques, they're able to do more of that because they've got the facilities and the space. But I do think there should be more of a push towards that, because the mosques can offer a lot to the wider community, which is hopefully something that will start to happen.
Sorry, I want to say from multicultural, I meant not multi-faith, so multicultural as in often you go to a mosque and there'll be only South Asians, or there'll be only people from Africa.
Yeah.
How do we get that?
How do
we make mosques inviting for that?
Yeah, I think that's really a sort of a challenge for the management and for the people who are running the mosque, because now you do find that mosques that did start as quite distinct kind of like ethnic communities, which is understandable because same language, same experience and so on, gradually have started to find their congregations much more diverse because many more different types of people have come into the area. And many mosques do embrace that. They different people from different backgrounds will come onto the mosque committee and they'll help run things. And you do get some really very multicultural mosques actually. But I think you're right, there are still many which will retain a very distinct kind of ethno-cultural identity. And then people from other communities don't feel that they can take part in that. But I think that's really about how it's being managed and the congregation and how they can actually make that change.
Thank you.
We are, yeah, I think we are just on time now. So I think that is the conclusion of that. Thank you very much to all of our speakers, actually, not just one, but all three, Shahid, Nabia, and Hannah as well. Thank you for joining us today. And we're gonna go very quickly into the Azan now. So we'll do the thanks after again, very shortly.
الله إني لك صمت وبك آمنت وعلى رزقك أفطرت ذهب الظمأ وابتلت العروق وثبت الأجر إن شاء الله.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح
اللهم رب هذه الدعوة التامة والصلاة القائمة آت محمدا الوسيلة والفضيلة وابعثه مقاما محمودا الذي وعدته إنك لا تخلف الميعاد.
Thank you everyone for joining today. I'd like to say a big thank once more to our speaker Shahid Salim for today's event. It was fantastic, very interesting, very engaging, and I'm sure everyone learned a lot more as well today. So big thanks once again to Shahid Salim. I just want to say once again a big thank you to Islam Channel, our media partner this year, and also to the Arts Council UK for making this event possible. And you can read more about how we're fighting world hunger with Islamic relief at iruk.co/RTP. Ramadan is a month of giving and charity, so we want to encourage you to support the Ramadan Tent Project and help us to continue our work. And your support is vital to keep us going as the world transitions back to a degree of normality, and to help us to continue our open iftars, our sunnah fasts and other events. You can find out more and donate at our website, ramadantentproject.com, or on our launchgood.com/RTP 2021. And thank you once again for joining us today. I hope you have a lovely evening, and Assalamu alaikum.